On behalf of the UCLA L&D Leve Center for Jewish Studies, I'd like to welcome you to today's event, which highlights Rachel Kaufman's recent work entitled Many to Remember. Many thanks for inviting me. Many thanks to the center and to Chelsea White for organizing, and David Wu for helping in the setup, and everyone else who was involved. So Rachel Kaufman's book can be found through the small press distribution, and we'll include a link for that after the discussion. The center thanks you for staying socially distant and intellectually engaged by joining us for these virtual events. So let me introduce our guest for today. Rachel Kaufman is currently pursuing a PhD in Latin American and Jewish history at UCLA. Her poetry has appeared on poets.org and in the Harvard Review, Southwestern American Literature, Western Humanities Review, Juxtaprose, and elsewhere. And her prose has appeared in the Yale Historical Review and in Rethinking History. She received a BA in English and History from Yale University. So the poetry collection, Rachel's first, Many to Remember, was published by Madres Press in 2021. It enters the archive's unconscious to reveal the melodies hidden within the language of the past. The collection unravels Rachel's historical research of New Mexican crypto-Jews and the Mexican Inquisition, alongside her own family histories. So we will be exploring questions related to Rachel's interests and some of the themes in the book regarding memory, media, translation, and this is one of Rachel's own questions, which I believe, with which I believe she pursued this book, which is how can poetry translate history and the rhythms and forms of the archive? So without further ado, welcome, Rachel.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dalia. I'm very excited to be in conversation with you today. I think it's going to be a wonderful event. And thank you to Chelsea and David and Sarah and everyone at the Leve Center for making this event possible. I'm very honored to be here. So I'm going to share a presentation and maybe talk for 10 or 15 minutes about some historical background of the book, read a few poems and talk about the archival sources from which those poems emerged. And then I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll turn this into a conversation. So I became fascinated with crypto-Jewish history and memory in somewhat of a roundabout way. I began by studying Hebrew poetry in Muslim Spain and really fell in love with the poetry, and then spent some time in Spain and became interested in how Spain was remembering and memorializing its Jewish history, and then traveled to the Southwest, a part of the Sephardic diaspora, and found a wealth of materials in the archive of crypto-Jewish voices in recent years, reclaiming and re-narrating their place in history and in the complex landscape of identity in New Mexico from the colonial period to the 20th century. And I also found that across the 20th century, scholars had approached this history often through a lens of authenticity, through attempts to discover material threads of continuity, or through determination to sequester Sephardic identity in the Southwest into a category distinct and separate from other identities essential to the land and history of the region, including Chicanx and indigenous identities. As historian Maria Elena Martinez writes, arriving at definitive conclusions about what transpired is ultimately less important than comprehending the historical and cultural context that made certain phenomena or identity constructions possible, at least in the eyes and imaginations of those who described them. And so I approach the past with an emphasis on how and why community members have identified themselves over time and how they've reconstructed identities specifically from a fragmented record, from an archive of absence. My historical and poetic works aim to preserve these silences while uncovering and bolstering the voices and imaginations of those erased and held within those silences. And so my often comparative work begins with and is guided by memory. And with that, I'll dive a little bit into a brief overview of what crypto-Judaism is. Crypto-Jewish identity begins with the creation of Sepharad, a geographic entity of the 9th century that served as a site of Jewish cultural identity formation. First mentioned in the Bible in the book of Obadiah, Sepharad became synonymous with Spain by the Middle Ages and was a site of cultural and religious harmony and violence between Christians, Muslims, and Jews. Though some forced conversions of Jews took place in the late 6th and early 7th centuries on the Iberian Peninsula, a wave of violence post-1391 resulted in the widespread emergence of crypto-Judaism. In 1391, a year of pogroms led to the murder or conversion of the majority of the Spanish Jewish population, and crypto-Judaism, secret religious practice, and a new social group called conversos, or new Christians, converted ones, emerged. In the 15th century, the enmity of many old Christians towards Jews shifted into a distrust of conversos, new Christians with impure racial lineages, culminating in the Spanish Inquisition around 1478. The Decree of Alhambra, ordered by the Catholic monarchy in 1492, ordered all Jews not already converted to convert, or if they refused baptism, to be expelled. Hidden faith traveled through Jewish diaspora to the Ottoman Empire, to Europe, and to the Americas. And these are two images from Spain, one of the old Jewish quarters on the right, and on the left, a site that they've marked as a place in which Inquisition trials took place. And here we can see the global reach of the Spanish and Portuguese empires, and thus of the branches of the Inquisition, which emerged across the world. Converso conquistadores fled to the new land, including Luis de Carvajal, the governor who colonized the region of Nuevo León in 1571, and who brought over many family members, some of them actively practicing crypto-Jews. And his Inquisition trial from 1589 is on this slide. Most of Carvajal's family was later killed by the Mexican Inquisition, a branch of the Spanish Inquisition established in Mexico City in 1571. The majority of Inquisition trials, or autos de fe, acts of faith, of crypto-Jews, because I want to point out that the Inquisition in Mexico City tried crypto-Jews, but in larger numbers, there were trials of Mexican and indigenous peoples for bigamy, for witchcraft, and also there was a secular Inquisition that revolved often around economic matters. But the crypto-Jewish cases, which occurred in Mexico City, took place mostly during the 1580s to 90s and the 1640s. These trials of public penance demanded that crypto-Jews reconcile with the church and give up their properties. They enumerated the core decrees of the Inquisition, emphasizing the statute of limpieza de sangre, or purity of blood, across generations. Increased inquisitional presence in Mexico, along with colonial opportunity, pushed conversos north into the region which would become New Mexico. Despite geographical distance from Mexico City, crypto-Jews continued to practice their religion secretly. A small number of individuals were brought from New Mexico to be tried for heresy or Judaizing. Crypto-Judaism remained a hidden religion following Mexico's independence from Spain in 1821, though there is little evidence of crypto-Jewish practice or punishment available to researchers from the 19th century. Over the years, crypto-Judaism mixed with other cultural or religious practices, creating a multicultural, multi-religious set of traditions. Beginning in the 20th century and continuing into recent years, crypto-Jews in New Mexico have begun to reclaim aspects of their Jewish identity, tracing traditions back through usually maternal lines. And on the left, we have an image from the Jewish cemetery on the outskirts of Segovia in Spain, a photo that I took. And then on the right is a photo from photographer Carrie Hertz's book on images and memory of crypto-Jews, of different gravestones that she was photographing around New Mexico, in which she found elements of Christianity and Judaism, or symbols of those religions. So Hebrew letters and a cross, for example. Here we have a poem written by crypto-Jew Isabel Medina Sandoval, called Trancas Abiertas, or Opened Locks, which was published in a 1996 exhibition in New York, in which New Mexican poets, artists, and historians celebrated Sephardic Judaism's presence in the New World by means of the myth of La Llave, or the key. The myth claims that when Jews left the Iberian Peninsula during the 14th and 15th centuries, they took with them the keys to their homes in the hope that they might someday return. The keys perhaps no longer contain the hope of actual return, though some physical keys continue to be passed down through generations. But instead, La Llave today serves as a symbol of a lost homeland and an emblem imbued with sensual and material nostalgia and longing of renewed Jewish and Sephardic identity for crypto-Jews in the Southwest. So I approach these archives in my historical research to better understand how crypto-Jews in New Mexico were remembering and reconstructing their Sephardic and crypto-Jewish identities, and how these identities intersected and intersect with the ethnic, racial, and religious landscape of the Southwest. I was soon drawn, as I did my research, to the materialities and memories of the archive itself. And so I began to write poems which emerged from my interactions with these archival sources. As the collection, many to remember, expanded, I began to reflect not only on the histories in front of me, but on the patterns and ruptures I found between crypto-Jewish memory and my own family's memories of our heritage. The poetry collection, which emerged from my research and reflections, weaves together archival sources, oral histories, and linguistic play, encountering nostalgia, memory, and trauma in stories both distant from and near to my own. The project has led me to questions of genre, translation, and empathy, including how can the juxtaposition of old and new language reveal historical continuities and ruptures? Can poetry balance history and memory, weaving underrepresented voices into accepted narratives? And how can poetry translate the sensory and spiritual remnants of history, visible and latent in archival texts? As scholar Mary Carruthers notes in her work on medieval literature, remembering is a visual act, a matter of images etched into physical places in the brain. Visuality enables recall. Poetry then, with all of its sensory capabilities, brings the past to life multidimensionally. The words come into being like flowers, as Hölderlin, the German romantic poet, wrote. Minutiae, oddities, colors of a historical period emerge in the poetic line. Poetry foregrounds the materiality of history. In the Center for Southwest Research at the University of New Mexico, where I do most of my research, I learned that while in prison in Mexico City, Luis de Carvajal el Mozo, the nephew of Carvajal, the conquistador and governor of Nuevo León, a crypto-Jew who would later be executed for his sustained Jewish practices, inscribed letters to his sisters inside fruits and vegetables. What emerged from this discovery was a poem which attempts to make sense of sensory pleasure, transmission, and creation amidst persecution and violence. The image of letters etched inside the flesh of fruits remains at the center of this history. And I'll read the poem which emerged from this archival discovery, and it's called Inquisition Letters. And I think I'll maybe read 3 poems and then turn things over to Dalia and me to discuss. Inquisition Letters. The legs put a lighthouse on the hill, the knees extended to form a tree. The world was created by feet padding through time. The tree that formed was very tall, the lighthouse white and cracked, tiles sent over with imprints by pigs' hooves to make them tried, the hooves and tiles. But some ran and didn't walk, and they cracked, the tiles and pigs. In the desert, the rain brings up salt, then soil, so following each storm, the farmers go out and water the earth back down. The ancient, frail man is very virtuous and helps the farmers, calling bendita as they bend over their fields. The woman opens up as if land accepting water. The letters brought news like this. Words scratched on peach and avocado pits, wrapped in taffeta and hidden in melons, or wrapped in ribbons and pocketed inside banana's skin. The sweetest were meant for the jailed man's favorite, Doña Ana, or really his favorite of those close by. His best sister remained in a cell far away with a darker woman, unable to send pits or pears. Her hands traveled the wall each day, feigning engraving. A lute is playing softly, and its breeze is mixing with the light beneath her door. Everyone is wearing hats in the dark and counting their days with ticks on the palms of their hands. Peaches all gone. One image for this poem engendered a world of mythology, as it seemed as likely to me that a religious prisoner would send words and prayers in the pits of peaches as it does that a body could slowly unfold and create the universe. Luis de Carvajal, in his stitched together autobiography, referred to himself as Joseph Lumbroso, or Joseph the Enlightened. His writings dwelled in prayer and mysticism and revealed an intention to transcend. I'm going to skip, I have some poems on the myth of La Llave, but I'm going to skip here to this poem. Poetry can hold simultaneities, the overlay of my voice, the contemporary Southwest landscape, and Carvajal's theological musings, as we just saw, and especially dissonant simultaneities, in a way in which academic prose and perhaps even creative prose cannot. In the preface to his translation of Arthur Rimbaud's Illuminations, John Ashbery writes, "Absolute modernity was for Rimbaud the acknowledging of the simultaneity of all of life, the condition that nourishes poetry at every second." If a poem can hold the simultaneities of the present, it can also, I think, relay those of the past. A poem transmits the ambiguities and multiplicities of historical narratives, the discrepancies between an Inquisition trial transcription and oral histories of crypto-Jews, between expulsion edicts of the Spanish crown and mystical letters written by an exile in a Mexico City jail. Contradictions come naturally to the form of a poem, which often holds in balance discordant images and thoughts without providing a clear or single explanation of coherence. A poem can at once relay the domestic and the otherworldly. In the following poem, images of the past seep into an image of the present, landscapes overlaid in coherence and incoherence. The poet's voice surfaces to join past and present. And this poem is called Prophetess. Prophetess. I saw the oldest woman in the world die today in Florida, in a pool of blue glass, ice cold, she said. Her brown skin layered in perfect circles like the rings of a lake expanding after interruption. She walked like a swan, toes out, nose up, and it could be Egypt, the desert, a Mexican plaza lined with gold that held her small feet as she shuffled along. The fish, dead, roll beneath in water thin and clear, washed up from bathhouses and purity cellars, doorways inked with secret symbols, and pig's blood soaking through the floor. A poem can live as it does, as this one does, within the present and past simultaneously, intertwining historical voices with the voice of the poet, who can reveal her process of unearthing the past through the form of the poem, its melodies and ruptures. The unique tools of the poet, rhyme and rhythm, line and line break meter, lay bare the skeleton of historical investigation and unveil its decodings, uncertainties, and revelations. The following poem, which is the last I'll read, attempts to articulate this process of discovery and translation, and it's called Manuscript. And on the right is just a beautiful seal from a document I was working from. Manuscript. Extended palm, inscribed flower, cross in oval frame. Extend this skin to find ground, minerals beat and barley, fleshed like fables that craft and crawl along slopes, scripts, handwriting scrawls. One came, one leapt before the sun grew tall. Of those who have written this renewal ink and line is barely pressed under different stamp. Flapping her wings, the dove begins to wail. Can I catch her song as she falls? Okay, so I'll stop this screen. And I'm excited to talk with you, Dalia.
Thank you, Rachel. That was a great presentation. You know, some artists are the best at analyzing their own work, and no one can top them. So I'm not going to attempt to do that, but you did a really great job of explaining things. But I also found that actually, I was thinking your poems made me think about some of the issues that you addressed in your presentation, and I'm glad that we're going to meet in a common place between sort of how you came to understand the role of poetry in understanding the past, or at least interpreting, symbolizing, and really working with the past. And because that's what I see you doing, and working with the past, and working and kind of stretching, what you've learned, what you've found, what you've read, and kind of putting them in all different shapes. The poems are of such variety that I am hard pressed to kind of identify sort of one single way in which you rewrite the histories that you found. So there's a great variety, and there's a great number of things to talk about. So thank you for inviting me to do this with you, because it was an enriching experience, but I was reading it on my own, so I'm really happy to be able to talk about it with you. You will be the first person with whom I will talk about this book, but not the last. So many of the things you said resonated with me. And of course, looking at the book, from the title to the questions that you've posed about it, I want to know sort of how you brought translation into this landscape that you have uncovered. Why translation? So what is the difference between historical poetry, like the ancient epics about historical figures and events, and even the contemporary historical poetry, Derek Walcott, right? So, I mean, what is the difference between looking at the poems that work with history as historical poetry, as opposed to translation of history, where the poems are translating history, which is how you present them? So can you talk a little bit about this translation process? Is it a metaphor, or is it something else beyond that too?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a great question, and some great comments to think about too. I think, well, I'll start with the fact that each poem is different, I think, is emblematic of how I'm thinking about this translation mode. Because each poem that begins from either the archive or from my own family oral histories is an act of translation, which is reliant and which begins with another text. And so the form of the poem then has to mirror or engage with its original text, and the process of translating that archive or that part of history will be different based on the rhythms, the language of the text with which it begins. And I think one way that this poetry is maybe archival poetry, even more so than historical poetry, is that it's often grounded in language of the past rather than events of the past. And so the process of translation, I'm thinking about many things. I'm thinking about the strangeness of the archive, of these incantatory rhythms of Inquisition documents language, which is really where this collection began, as I was stumbling across this enigmatic difficult and often violent language of Inquisition documents. And I didn't know how to translate that strangeness and density and to preserve that language of the past through anything besides poetry, through more language. And so I think about in the translation process how to preserve that strangeness, that sort of residue of old language. And I'm interested in where the poet's hand and voice are in this process of translation. And so I'm tracing the poet's hand, the shadow over the page as one kind of language turns into another. And I think I'll ground this a little in maybe 3 different ways that I'm thinking about translation. And also I can talk about some other poets who are doing similar things. So one mode of translation is the poem is translating the archive. And I said a line from a Hölderlin poem, the German Romantic poet, but he also says, and this is an epigraph to one of the poems in the book, and a holy wilderness has sunk roots where much is being readied. And I think that idea of a holy wilderness with its roots sunk, much is being readied, that to me feels like the space of the archive. And so I sort of grapple with in this book these pulsings latent in the archive's unconscious, these roots that you stumble across, which are being readied, which are in process, which are in movement already. And so how do you attach yourself to that movement? How do you bring that movement into the present moment? I'm also thinking about translating across time and space. And this is maybe more of a historical question. And Prophetess, the poem that I read, in which past and present are really overlaid on top of one another through image, is a good demonstration of how I think poetry can collapse time, but preserve incoherence, but not assert that there's some sort of continuity across time and space. If I were to write 2 sentences in a historical paper in which I traverse 500 years of history, perhaps people would pause, and maybe rightfully so. But in a poem which is constantly marking rupture and is refusing continuity because of its form, space and time can be collapsed without it being a collapse. So that's another, I'm thinking about translation in terms of time too, and poetic form. And then the last way is perhaps the most difficult and also the most important to me, I think, which is translation of the sacred. And I'm thinking about Michael Heller and other sort of Jewish poetics, diaspora poetics, who are writing about what it means to translate the sacred. Yerushalmi, right, bemoaning that we no longer know what to turn from history into memory, sort of what do we take from our past and turn into the sacred. And a lot of that process relies on absence, in that we're both making and marking as a form of revelation, but we're acknowledging what we cannot acknowledge, we're acknowledging what is unspoken. And this, maybe I'll pause there, but this relates to historical work too, to Saidia Hartman, Marissa Fuentes, who are writing. So these are questions I think about in the historical context too, of what do we do with an archive of absence? How do we embody and give life to, for example, female bodies in the archive who are buried beneath layers of violence in a colonial archive, which those 2 scholars are working with? How do we add presence while acknowledging absence, while not erasing that violence has been done? And that the archive is often a site, a place of violence. So I have sort of historical models who are working with turning absence into presence without losing the importance of silence. And then poets who are doing that too, like Susan Howe, Elizabeth Gray, M. Norbese Phillip, all of these poets who are grappling with the archive, with both what is there and what is not there, and attempting to translate that.
Great. I'm going to try to unpack a little bit of what you said, just kind of taking strands, because obviously you've thought so much about all this. Yeah, it's packed. I mean, this book itself is an archive of archives, and in so many ways. I was wondering if we could take a step back and sort of just, think about the poetry history connection, both with regard to translation, but also just in terms of sort of more, commonplace understanding of each, right? So how do poetry and history really combine? In your presentation, you talked about what poetry can do that history or even prose may not. But you also touched on this idea of authenticity in when you first started working on crypto-Jews, right? And so I was wondering what you make of this idea that history, despite all the critiques and despite all the all the new interpretive readings we have done of history, is still trades in the idea of truth, right? So the discovery, the uncovering of truth. And poetry, well, not so much, right? And so these two, when they're put together, especially with the crypto-Jewish history and the kind of tropes that we have about crypto-Jewishness, which is embedded in the name, right? The secrets. So it becomes even more of a great and delicious challenge to put poetry and history together, where history doesn't like secrets so much. History looks to uncover secrets, right? And poetry, well, looks at how it works, how secrets work, right? And the poem that you read, where words scratched on peach and avocado pits. I mean, that's you're gesturing to the idea of the secret, but how do you uncover things and then preserve the secrets that remain? The silences and the secrets that remain. How do you do that? The translation process is not so easy, I imagine.
Yeah. Well, I love poetry looks at how secrets work. I think that's what poetry does. I mean, I think I'll start from the first question you asked, which is about history and poetry, especially in the context of crypto-Jewish history, which is mostly emerging from an archive of fragmentation from a century where there's almost no sort of material trace of secret religious practice. And I'm thinking about specifically how time functions in history and poetry. And with some of the works that I'm writing alongside, I'm disrupting on crypto-Judaism, often, and I'm thinking of even starting in the 1940s, of texts of anthropologists going to crypto-Jewish communities in the Ottoman Empire, in Mexico City, and writing these historical texts, these truthful, in quotation, texts, which are intent on pointing out continuity in crypto-Jewish lineage as a means of thinking about Jewish survival. If we have, this is in the 1940s, when news, in the 1950s, when news of the Holocaust is coming to some of these New York Jews, are the scholars who I work with sometimes. And so if they have found this community in Mexico who have preserved Judaism for hundreds of years with sort of no change, with this sort of powerful stagnancy, what an emblem of Jewish survival that can become. And so I think in history, the impulse when you have an archive that has so many gaps in it is to try to draw threads of continuity, because history has changed over time and we need to be tracing change consistently over time. Whereas poetry is less concerned with time, and I'm less concerned with time, as I think I need to be as I'm approaching an archive like this one. And poetry dwells in myth. I mean, Hayden White is a big influence for me as a historian, thinking about how our historical narratives are filled with fiction and filled with just form, filled with narrative form and storytelling. And so poetry can can sort of sit inside of those uncertainties without hesitation. And because poetic form, because we have all of these tools, which I mentioned very briefly, but because we have rhythm, because we can put words next to one another and allied consonants and bring the words close together, or have consonants that draw the words in our mouths apart from each other. We can create, so we can play with space and time, with how we're marking the past and its ruptures and continuities at once, without sort of any impulse of drawing this thread backwards through time with any semblance of continuity. And I think that's also how to preserve silences. I think some of the poets who I draw from, even sort of beyond Jewish poetics, some in Jewish poetics, but Norbise Philip, Lorene Nidecker, George Oppen, even Emily Dickinson, who I've been immersed in recently, the way that silence and space function in a poem. Poets are very comfortable, and poems require dwelling in silence and absence, and portraying or relaying or telling through silence as much as through sound. And so in that way, translating silence in an archive, you can do as a historian, like Hartman and Fuentes are doing, but it comes very naturally to the form of a poem.
So then, that's really interesting. So then, because you mentioned Sadie Hartman a couple of times, the notion of critical fabulation, sort of recreating or in fact, replacing or substituting for the silences in history by a kind of a critical invention of, what's not there in the archive. Well, then I'll tell a story of what could have been, right? The what could have been. So you seem to be saying that, well, in poetry, that's not even necessary, that you can recreate the silences without substituting for them.
Yeah, exactly. And I think Hartman has some hesitancy built into her idea of imagination of, I am imagining, but I don't want to fill in every gap, because that would be in some way violent to the archive or distortive of what the historical experiences were of these enslaved women. And so I think it's not necessary in the poem, but also the poem can sort of sit inside that hesitancy of imagining while refusing to relinquish those silences, which are as much a part of the history that we want to carry forward.
Right. Yeah, it's interesting because there's, again, so much in your book, and at the same time you represent the silences visually, and maybe I hope we'll get to talk about your last poem, The Re-Exodus, to give the audience a sense of that, where you let the silence be through blank spaces on the text, through the mise en page. But then there's all the other stuff, which is, you have multiple languages, you have, a very strong sort of intertextual bent. You draw on the Jewish literary tradition, in the Jewish textual tradition, religious tradition, and then so many different kinds of works, from romantic poets to Virginia Woolf's dog-inspired book, Flush. So I just wanted to tease out a couple of those aspects. So the textual traditions that you refer to are many, but you have two poems that are actually titles, the same titles as the books you have read and encountered. So one of them is the Me'am Loez, and the other one, so that's Hebrew, right, from the Sephardic tradition. And then there's the Libro de Cordilleras. And so one from a Spanish colonial as one Spanish colonial text and then a Hebrew religious text. And so the titles exist in their original languages. And so I was wondering what you're doing in these poems that are translating them, the untranslated title, but, what in the content of the poem you have translated. And the poems, Ma'am Noed is on page 16. If you want to read just a couple of lines or just tell us what it's about. And then the Libro de Cordilleras is really interesting too. So if you could just either summarize it or just give us a sense of what you did with these texts, these old ancient texts.
Yeah. Let's see. I'll start with Ma'am Noed's. And this book I encountered in a Ladino context. I was studying the book of Esther. The Ma'am Noed is an anthology of commentaries on different books of the Torah, written across many years in the Ottoman Empire. And the first was written by Rabbi Cooley in the 18th century. And it's in the notes of the book under the Ma'am Noed's poem. But the poem began with a line that I encountered in his sort of translation, his midrashic interpretation / literal translation, in which he wrote, "The light that remains in our world is merely a seventh of the light that existed during the days of creation. Some say that this primeval light was 60,075 times as bright as the light of the sun." And I think I was thinking about this idea of light in relation to translation. If over time, the light that we experience in the world is merely a seventh of the light that existed at one time, that seems to echo in some ways the loss that we have as we're translating. And I think part of this translation process is also this acute awareness of what is being lost. And so this poem, I can read just a little bit of it. It also began as a sonnet, and then I broke it into lines as a means of showing maybe the imperfectness of translation. But it goes, "The winter nights are very long. The cockcrow turns our beds to song. Our house is safe through words of prayer, which tangle, circle, leave us there. We're told our souls will grow accustomed to hearing echoes of our customs, these chantings set apart from myth to keep some holiness adrift. It should be near, but not in hand, this spirit which envelops land, but never touches down to rest or settles in our eager breath. We're left with just 1/7 of the light. Our words collapse as all loses sight." Okay, I read the whole thing, but the rhyme carries you forward. I think this poem seems to be a diasporic poem in the way that Michael Heller writes about diasporic poetics, in that it is very aware of marking and making as a form of revelation. Our house is safe through words of prayer. There's some sort of encircling or enveloping that these old words of a different language have in keeping us safe. But it's merely an echo. We're accustomed to hearing echoes of our customs. So it's this relationship between custom and growing accustomed, or complacent is too harsh of a word, but complacent with sort of distance or absence, with hearing an echo rather than the original. So I think this idea of translation, we're left with some sort of marking of something that was whole, and that wholeness is still existing, but very latent and important to that wholeness is the echo and consciousness of that echo. And I think a lot of my poetry is exactly struggling with what it means to be inside of that echoing, and still feeling those reverberations, but very aware of and wanting to preserve the fact that it's shedding as it reaches us, or it's settling on us with 1/7 of the light. So that's the Ma'am Noed's poem, and it also comes from my own practices with religious texts. So that's also a personal poem in many ways. And the Libro de Cordilleras poem emerges from this pretty boring book. It's sort of news. It's colonial news. It's a very governmental book. But what's incredible about it is because it's been sitting in the archive since the 19th century, bookworms have carved out holes in its pages that sometimes cut through 100 pages. So you're looking at maybe page 5 and you see these, really intricate shapes that are incredible. A bookworm, and also a bookworm exists, could have carved these gorgeous, it looked like the cosmos. It was like a moon and star, just shapes that cut through the text. And so thinking about time and translation, what does it mean that you're on page 4 and there's time is literally seeping forward in that it has aged away and cut into a book so that you can see the last page of the book. And of course, what does it mean that we're missing words sort of horizontally on one page, but also vertically through time as the whole cuts through. And so this poem, I must have something to say about wormhole branches cut into brown-bound, leather-sated, book-creased ink drawings intended as letters, holes no absence or presence, with these incredible shapes. I think it was very emblematic of a lot of the work I was doing to see these holes, which in some way had just as much presence as the words on the page, as the script that I was struggling to decode. So that was a perfect metaphor of what is this hole that is nothing and is absolutely holding real substance of history and time and what the translation process looks like.
I really thought this one was emblematic of the book. Of course, the title is a dedicatory, but this book, this poem, to me, distills so much of what you've done in the book as a whole, and some of the, many of the ideas that you brought together. But also, it incorporates sort of the differences in tone, register, and style within it that you kind of have throughout the book, because it starts out with a narrative. I must have something to say about wormhole branches, etc. And then the second half of the poem is just sort of associations, right? Dot, line, dot, bleed, pig, fire, flea, my grandfather again, white, glass, blue, sea. So there's some rhythm and rhyme, but really the narrative has disappeared and we just have these associations. So you have this kind of variety within just a single poem too, that you have across. And I thought that was really interesting. And the other thing, of course, is, you've already talked about the violence in the archives, and the violences that are covered by the silences in a way. And here, your grandfather and the history of the Holocaust, and also the pre-Holocaust communities in Eastern Europe, are kind of coming together with the violence of the documentary history of the Inquisition and colonialism, of course. So can you say a little bit more about that? Because, you're bringing together the Holocaust and the Inquisition in this book. And I'm wondering, you did mention in your presentation about, how, and also I think in your notes about how there's overlaps and differences in the two histories. But I was wondering also, is there a translation going on between the Holocaust and Inquisition, or is that, is there another kind of idea operating behind this juxtapositions?
Yeah, this is a guiding question of my historical work, which is often comparative and straddling lines of analogy hesitantly, and of my poetic work of this book. I might answer the question first with a poem and then unpack it. I have a poem called Translation, which is it begins the final section of the book, Behind the Brush. And so I'll read this poem and then and then talk about translation and this Holocaust Inquisition. Not pairing, but existence. They're next to each other in some way. Translation. At the edge of words, I accompany you, seeing. What you put in this earth comes in letters, parts, apart from what I take, my truth of tradition, ascending, adjacent. Your wisdoms cling, prosper, yet exceed their means. Unable to sieve the past's near ending and my nearing to you. Alphabet gardened, growing, holding its fullness, I come to provide. Print these knowings and follow your sufferings from where they came. And so I think, and maybe I'll read one other poem at some point as we're talking about this, but I think my role as a translator of my grandfather's stories, who's Zeta in my life and in this book, and as a translator of the archive and of these stories of the Inquisition, felt similar enough that I could hold them together without placing the histories next to each other. It felt more that I was placing, I was thinking about how to hold these two processes of transmission, because I am often the oral history recorder in my family, and a lot of the crypto-Jewish, especially women in the archive, were the oral history recorders of their families. And so more than holding the histories at once, it felt as I was holding these two very separate lines of transmission or attempt to transmit. And the sort of idea of seeking the Mother of Exile poem in this book, which comes from a poem written by Emma Moya, who's a crypto-Jew who has her collections archived at the University of New Mexico. Her work is filled with longing, and you can hear the playing. Her longing and seeking, that impulse seemed like something I could hold close to my impulse to transmit. And I think the book is very aware, and I think poetry makes this awareness very possible in a way that you could put sort of a sentence to frame your historical, your research paper, but in a poem, you can embed your sort of uncertainties and uncertainties in every part of the poem. And I think the poem that I just read is very aware of translation also as a potentiality, but also as a burden. And I was constantly aware of what I was borrowing, what voices and stories I was borrowing, especially in the archive section of the book, which has at its core the sort of inevitable shortcomings of the process of translation. And I think I'm thinking also about Michael Rothberg's work of multidirectional memory, which was one of the foundational texts when I began thinking about becoming a historian. And his model of memory requires simultaneity. One group remembers their traumatic past along with the traumas and experiences of another group, and the traumas sit next to each other, but not competitively. They must sort of share space. And I think a poem, I talked a little bit about that Ashbery quote and simultaneity in poetry. And because everything in a poem sort of sits on the surface of itself, each word and each line holds an image, or it signifies an image, but it also exists because it's a poem. It exists as word, as metaphor, sort of as such, as rhyme, as rhythm. It sort of holds on to its most surface, most quality. And I think that sort of objectness of the poem means that you're never sort of asserting this straightforward comparison of Inquisition and Holocaust, or this line of continuity between the two, which of course has been in historical works of a few decades ago, of this instinct to sort of draw a line back from the Holocaust to the Inquisition, or to trace moments of Jewish oppression, Jewish violence across time. And so I think poetic form really helps avert that impulse, while still holding two instincts or two desires somewhat in the same space, but as distinct elements. but several of the poems are sort of aware that you're at the limit, or the book or I am at the limit of where analogy or comparison is. I think that's a very interesting place to sit at, and to see what I felt like I could hold on to, what I could possess, and what was not mine to carry or to hold.
That's really interesting. It is a, very different treatment from historicizing treatment that you mentioned too, right? Which draws continuities and similarities and parallels, and so and here there's just kind of juxtapositions, within the poem, or poems that are next to each other, and they're not divided. You have several sections, and the poems are divided into several sections, but they coexist, right? The ones that are about, the ones that are referred to the Holocaust, they're not about the Holocaust, but and the Inquisition. So it is a very unique kind of treatment of these kind of overdetermined stories, that the way that they've been treated in both history and I would say in a lot of the poetry, especially contemporary poetry about crypto-Jewishness. So let me ask you, as we're kind of coming to a close, I have many more questions, but a couple of other questions about, so in terms of your approach to, sound and tonality, and, like I said, I see a lot of variation across the book. And so, how do you approach silence with sound? And the sounds are so different from one poem to the, you have alliterations, like a poem about the Cossacks, or it starts with the Cossacks, cozying, Cossacks crawl, cringing. And so you feel the violence of the K's, of those sounds, and then others are, they're not soundless, but they're sort of seem very neutral in terms of sound, but they're you have rhymes, then you omit rhymes, mostly, I guess. So how did you see the book yourself, aesthetically speaking? Yeah, and especially in terms of sound,
Yeah, I have one answer specific to the book, and one answer is how I approach sound in general, which is that I have a classical musical background, and that I was trained in Baroque music and opera, and so breath, beyond the realm of the project, because this in some ways is a project book and in some ways isn't. But even beyond the realm of the book, I'm thinking about sound always in terms of breath, and in terms of with sort of my singer's background and where vowels and consonants live in the throat and the mouth and the head, and how things resonate. And so some sound is just how breath unfolds. And I think about Gwendolyn Brooks and her approach to sound and music. G.C. Waldrop, who's a lesser known poet, but who writes beautifully with and about music. So sound in some ways is very rooted just to breath as I'm writing. And then other poem, the Cossack poem, it felt like a density of sound was required, because I was trying to enter sort of the density of myth. And that density I could mirror in consonant density. And then a poem like Observant Maranos, which begins with this colonial document, which I was alluding to a little bit earlier, from the 1940s by the Mexican Indian the American Jewish Friends of the Mexican Indian Jews. The rhythm of that pamphlet, which sort of echoed the rhythm of Inquisition documents, the sort of incantatory sound of the documents in which words are always collapsing on themselves. That sort of rhythm I was trying to preserve. That was sort of the strangeness of the archive, the violence of the archive I was trying to preserve through sound and through rhythm. And I think a lot of the poems are sort of vertical. They're sort of falling, and maybe the way Lorraine Nideker's poems seem to sort of fall, or maybe George Oppin's poems fall across space. And I think a lot of that feeling of falling was, and a lot of the lines are shorter. I'm working now on some longer lines. A lot of these lines felt like they had to be shorter because the archive gives you shortness usually. And so to echo that, I think that sort of brevity guided the sound of the line and the way the sounds were interacting with each other. Yeah.
I was going to ask you about what you're working on next. That was going to be one of my closing questions, but I have two closing questions, if you don't mind. So you just mentioned working on something, but so first maybe tell us what you're working on, both in terms of poetry and also maybe your work as a graduate student, and what where are they meeting right now for you?
That's a great question, one I'm grappling with daily, especially the meeting place. Okay, so the poetry, I've been working on a new collection, which I started sort of in the depths of the pandemic, which is a project also of translation, but of a different kind. It emerges from a Talmudic practice that I have of reading a page of the Talmud every day. And that process is translating language to language, sometimes literally Hebrew, Aramaic to English, but sometimes English translation of the Talmud to more, I'm writing in English, but thinking about the rhythms, the densities, the beauty, the sort of legalistic structure of the Talmud, these different elements of language, and how that language is turning into, this book is really a book of mythology, in a way that some of this book became too. I have a section in here on different myths in which I'm writing about the Chelm myth, the Eastern European myth, the myth of Leve, the Sephardic and crypto-Jewish myth. And so it so far is sort of a collection of sonnets, and I'm playing with form and rhyme a little more in ways that some of the poems in this book begin to do. And some of those poems are being published soon, so something to look out for in Juxtaprose and Aurora, a literary magazine.
Great.
And then history-wise, I'm working on two articles, one about Chicana and crypto-Jewish poetry, and that feels relevant to this book, especially because I'm beginning with some of the poems from which my poems emerged, the Emma Moya poem, the Sandoval poem, and putting them in these sort of multi-directional contexts in a Southwest landscape. And then another project is on horses and women in the Southwest, in captivity narratives. And that actually also feels, while I was thinking this morning about what we might talk about, that when I was surprised that my thoughts on the translation of the sacred and of absence and of sort of Jewish poetics, the things that really guide diaspora poetics and my thinking on poetics, brought me right to this paper on women and horses and absence in the archive, and Hartman and Fuentes. And so I think what's connecting my work across history and poetry is grappling with absence and silence. And it's just translating itself differently in historical work than in poetry. But I think that's what's guiding me right now is confronting these archives of silence and figuring out what to preserve, how to translate them, and what this translation across genre, across form can look like.
Sounds great. Well, you have a terrific meeting place then for both kinds of work. And I was just going to ask you, just to close, sort of what are the just the practical meeting points and departures of doing academic study, and I understand you've been doing it pretty intensively in the last couple of years. I mean, in graduate school. So combining the academic study and then writing and reading poetry, what are the joys and the challenges of these two disciplines? I mean, I understand you have lots of themes and ideas in common, but in terms of the structures and in terms of just the materials you're dealing with, they're just so different. So how do you deal with all that?
Yeah.
I mean, most graduate students don't have any time except to just finish their papers, and they're reading and they can barely keep up, and they have to work. And so, so yeah, how do you do it all? And then how do you turn modes, from one mode to the other?
Yeah. No, it's often a challenge, and my plate often feels as though it's overflowing. I think in terms of challenges, sometimes it's just difficult to carve time in the day to read poetry, and to sink into poetry when your stack of books for your oral exams is also on your table. So I think logistically, time to absorb words is tricky, and I have to very sort of conscientiously carve out time to enter. Reading a poem is not, for me, the same experience as reading a historical monograph, so I have to be purposeful about it. In terms of joys, I think I'm finding that both parts of my brain, which are of course sometimes the same part, but both practices are really feeding off of each other, and I often find that, and I'm in this wonderfully supportive environment at UCLA where a lot of my historical work, literary criticism and poetics, is creeping in. So a book that I picked up for my poetry practice, I'm then using in a paper. And these ideas of silence and absence that I'm finding in historical monographs through graduate school, because a lot of these books I've read in the past 2 or 3 years, they're certainly informing my poetry practice. And then there's, of course, because I'm in graduate school, I can go to archives and do historical research and bring in a piece of paper to write a poem. So in that way, they're feeding off of each other wonderfully. And as a historian, I'm constantly encountering new material and new language and new story. And that, of course, is entering my poetic work. So on some days, it feels like they are overflowing next to each other. And then on good days, it feels like they are overflowing into some sort of cohesion. And that's always very gratifying.
Wow, that's impressive. It's great to hear. Well, Rachel, it was a huge pleasure to talk to you, and huge congratulations on this book. It was a great thing that we got in touch and we were able to talk about your book, and I hope we'll continue the conversations, both in the historical and the literary sense, for a long time. And good luck with all that you do.
Oh, thank you so much. This was truly a pleasure, and always a pleasure to read your work in general and hear your thoughts. And I know that your work has been a huge influence on the way I'm thinking about history and memory and the crossovers between literary studies and history and crypto-Jewish history. So just an honor to be in conversation with you.
Yes, let's do it again.
Sounds great.
Okay.